work with other fact checkers across both the EU bloc and beyond. I would not put myself out there to be, I don't have a doctorate in it necessarily, but what I do have is the day-to-day practice of leading a team, sitting in, I suppose, the fact-checking space, but also in a large popular news site. So we reach a lot of people in the Irish audience. So I'm going to explain a little bit, I think, around how fact-checking and news has intersected for us, why I think it's important, and how Ireland is in a very specific position as an Anglophone country, but largely, I suppose, receiving the effects of Anglophone misinfo and disinfo, and in a time when geopolitical shocks are really impacting the domestic news narratives. So we're sort of a microcosm that mirrors somewhat what's happening in the global scene. So yes, I can give you my experience, and I think we have time for Q&A at the end, Iker, if that's correct. So I'm going to try and not eat into your lunch too much and keep it to half an hour. We're starting at 5 past, so I'll try and get us done by 25 to 1 and open the floor for questions. So yeah, I'm also going to assume a lot of people here are not that familiar with the journal, so I might give us a little bit of a rundown of what we are, what we do, and where this has all come from for us. So, I'm trying to move. There we go. So the journal itself started in 2010, and we were the first online-only news outlet in Ireland. Ireland has always had quite a high news participation from the public. Well, traditionally, obviously, these things have changed and evolved quite rapidly with the online consumption habits that have evolved and changed, and how people are accessing the internet through these kind of devices. But we started that should say 2016 to 2026, I should say. Apologies for my slide. We began the fact check unit in 2016, early 2016, because we were very much a breaking news site back in the first few years, but we had started to evolve with the audience also evolving and staying online more and requesting more of us than just what was breaking, which at the time had been a differentiator, was no longer by 2015. 2016, the general election was called in Ireland, and I guess 2011, which had been the previous general election, had been seen as as the first social media election. Now, that was very tentative because really there wasn't an awful lot happening. There wasn't massive penetration of social media networks among the general Irish voter, but certainly there were a lot of people on Twitter at the time, as it was, and on Facebook, and there was more attention being paid. But by 2016, it was kind of undeniable. So you found political parties, election candidates were certainly putting out all of their materials online as well. And journalists had become more used to talking to people online, and there was certainly more activity happening there. I would say it was still very much kind of a broadcast situation when it came to the gatekeepers of information versus the general participant, the general public that were on social media at the time. But certainly by 2016, it was undeniable that a lot of people were starting to get their information there, or at least getting their information where they always had and having the discussions online later. So we decided to look at that, to look at fact-checking as an actual discipline. We looked at the States very much. The International Fact-Checking Network got involved with them in terms of understanding how to do this in a way that was consistent and trustworthy, and started doing it around the general election. So as a result, our 2016 intersection of fact-checking into the newsroom, it was very much embedded in the newsroom because it was around the biggest domestic news event at the time, which was the general election. At the time as well, what was happening in the news agenda in Ireland was it was largely very domestically driven. There was some sense of what happened internationally had an impact domestically, but very much, and probably because there was a general election, really focused on what your local politician was saying, what government parties you would like to see, recession-wise, what we considered to be the impacts on people and what they were thinking about going forward. So quite, I would say, Ireland focused. then that meant as well that when we were looking at fact checking, we were looking at fact checking what would have been recognized, I suppose, the old model where we were focusing on political speech from politicians and what they were saying. That meant that where we were surfacing the claims was from where politicians spoke. And where they spoke was still very much on the legacy media. They were doing the big TV shows, they were doing the radio shows, and we had a fact checker would listen in. There wasn't even, I guess, transcription tools really, and listening in for claims and going, oh, that sounds like a big claim. We had, what do we claim? Well, it has to be something that we can actually find data on, that we can find raw sources. We can't claim, projections for the future. So we had to have a very clear set of kind of understandings about what we could and couldn't fact check. We also pushed that out to the public, which was a very unusual thing at the time, and said, this is how we decide what to fact check. If you hear anything on the election trail that you're not sure about, send it to us. And we gave them an email. We set up a Twitter account, and we allowed people to send things in. So we got a really good number of claims that way. But really, that's where the claims were surfacing. And social media was there, but it was very much a tool of distribution rather than the narratives beginning there themselves. So that's where we started. Fact checking became very popular among our audience, and we kept it on beyond the general election project. So, I mean, it feels like a glory time that it would have been considered as such, and that fact checking was just giving 100% rating. Everyone was very positive about it. I think anyone who works in this space now or understands disinformation knows that fact checkers are being seen in a very different way, and in the same way as trust is being eroded against other pillars, mainstream journalism, the politicians, other, I suppose, experts, academics, and how that has been weaponized has also been experienced by fact checkers in that time. So if we go forward to 2026, here we are 10 years later, and what we're finding again, how having our fact check unit embedded in our newsroom, which I'll show you in a few minutes how we do that, is very much, I suppose, allowing us to try and tackle things that we know are shaping what people can and cannot take about the news agenda these days. It is very much trying to be responsive and, in fact, even get ahead of public concerns or public debates or questions that people have. So sorry, just the beeping from people coming in. I was thrown there for a second. It's great to see a great big audience here. So much more than 10 years ago, what we're looking at is what is happening on the global stage is very much informing what the headlines are going to be on a domestic news site like the Journal. All politics are local. They always said, well, this is very, very much true now, except, local has been reversed onto, war and conflicts and policies and administrative changes in countries far away from Ireland, but nonetheless impactful. So we find that our fact checks, if you look at what's here versus, if I can go back to the previous slide, those three there are very, very domestic. Alan Kelly, Minister. People who are not familiar, there was a big thing around water charges being introduced in Ireland. There were a lot of protests at the time. And, this was one of the ministers in charge of it saying, there's no problem here. Most people want to pay their water charges. And so we were like, is this true? 80% dug into the details. The Labour was another party that they're not really as popular now, but they were being tested on whether indeed they were very socially focused or not. And then below was Fine Gael, which is really large party, still is, and they were making a lot of claims about what they'd achieved in office and the jobs that they created. So these were often suggested by readers. It was really indicative of what was taking up space in people's minds. We would go to 2016. This is just a snapshot. I could have picked any snapshot, and I've done them all in order. I haven't cherry picked them. These are all kind of within the mix of a few days. Shane there is our chief fact checker. And what we're looking here is, I suppose, some of this is domestically focused, but nearly all of this, you can see the impact of global narratives on what's causing conversation in Ireland and what people are basing their decisions on, whether it's to vote, what to buy, what to put out on social media, how to support or not support things that are happening in their community. Politics, it's personalities, whether that's a creator online, whether that is the personality politics we see that have taken over in in very impactful states, and indeed how people are personalizing and stereotyping communities, organizations, narratives. It's not so much based on what you're hearing on the headlines on the radio anymore. Digital is not really just the place where we go to have the debate afterwards now. It's actually where the claims are coming from. This is why it makes it more and more difficult and makes it a bigger part of the job of fact checking and journalism to understand what indeed we should be even what we should be even trying to focus on. There is so much noise there that the biggest part of the job now is sifting the claims and deciding what should be fact checked. The actual fact checking and the efforts into that is less than 50%. We're also dealing with post-COVID news avoidance. So obviously the pandemic we saw a huge spike, like all media organizations, in audience numbers during COVID. The situation was changing so rapidly. It was also where we had a huge amount of disinformation, which we'll be talking about how the being in an Anglophone ecosystem, but being a tiny player in it, is really where you get to see how information flows digitally, where there is no border except for language. Um, so after COVID, though, audience numbers dropped because people were like, now that I know the worst has happened or what that looks like, I now can't deal with it anymore. I'm going to find my personal safe space, comfortable space, space that I feel speaks to my views online. And I don't think it's with mainstream media anymore. This has happened more and more. And it is also a case of, we are able to communicate better the impact of terrible things that are happening in different parts of the globe. And I suppose how that is fundamentally changing cost of living, people's security, immigration, and for a lot of people, that is too much personal stress. And so news represents a place that is unsafe for them now, so they find it elsewhere. When we're trying to make the argument that it's actually a safer space to be getting the information. And then fact checking and journalism has also undergone a sort of a strange relationship change where fact checking has existed for quite a long time. It's been a discipline within newsrooms. It is a discipline that I suppose people associate with something like the New Yorker, right, where they have very long pieces and they go through this major fact checking process. Very few places have an actual or ever had a fact checking desk that did all of that work. There's very few New Yorkers out there, but it was kind of embedded in processes. As the need for speed has increased with journalism, the ability to have fact checking as a discipline, as an undercurrent within newsrooms, has been more difficult. So we have found that something that we did 10 years ago as a project has ended up being a very, very useful day-to-day tool for the team out there. And we have dedicated fact checkers, but we've now started creating workshops to bring fact checking skills to the general newsroom because we find it so important that verification is happening live rather than reactive to something that's happening because the information has gone viral before you have a chance to get used to it. The adversarial nature of that had to be resolved then between fact checkers and journalism because fact checkers have become more prominent and didn't necessarily ask for it. As I've mentioned before, there's a certain amount of, I suppose, centralizing of the fact checker in things that have happened. Now, some of these are global and some of them are Irish specific, where I suppose with COVID, health misinformation has never really died down from that. Anti-vaccine sentiment and anti-vaccine narratives are still really, really strong and came back with the hantavirus there, which is why we had Shane analyze and try and give context for people about why you may be seeing a lot of this online now, which is a good service to complement the news that they're seeing about headlines of a cruise ship. We have AI generated content has now become a day-to-day reality for people. So that is also informing, I suppose, the ability for fact checkers to bring tools and in fact, digital tools that are being developed by researchers and academics and technological institutes and incorporating those into our work and making them palatable for the day-to-day journalist. But I suppose the tensions that we would have seen would have been like, speed versus accuracy, the need for engaging audiences on digital versus taking the time to verify, being objective versus should we put a moral framing on this? Are we just, dictaphones, or do we actually need to weigh the evidence here for people? And I suppose, the tension of that waiting of and coming up with a verdict, which is what fact checkers have to do as part of their skill set, versus basic chronological reporting. So all of these things have been quite adversarial. So for us, it has made a lot of sense to bring the two disciplines together. So this is where fact check, which is the name of what we call the journal fact check, it does what it says in the tin. We're trying to be quite explanatory. How it works within our newsroom. So it provides context for breaking news. Now, this isn't all the fact checkers producing this, but this is sort of the kind of skill set that we've brought into the newsroom. In the morning, we have a big news meeting, right? Early enough in the morning. The fact check team sit in that, and so do our investigative team. We don't see these things as separate efforts. We see them as finding different ways to bring what's impactful and decision informing news to people. And it might be that's where we're going to spend a month going off and diving into the figures, doing an investigation on that. This is where the fact check team will take the next 2 days to track down and source where this claim is coming from and try to explain to people, this is the evidence we're seeing, and giving them all the information to make up their mind themselves. Trying to be that sort of voice of calm in the middle of quite a lot of online noise. So providing context to breaking news is so important now, because breaking news is everywhere and it's table stakes. So giving timelines, making people understand that this is not the first time we've seen this. Taking time with data journalism, another skill that is falling behind the actual speed at which people are presented with. Here's a place where you can get the facts for yourself. We see it as a sort of in an era of diminishing the impact of experts and weaponizing expertise actually against the experts and saying they're trying to tell you what to do by dint of them knowing more. We see that internally as going, well, we have expertise in here. How can we lend it to each other? So the verification tools and the verification skills that the journal fact check team would have in things like recognizing Gen AI, understanding how to track down somebody who might be able to help verify that. It's not like we have a huge technical support system here. Understanding, I suppose, where to get trustworthy facts from and bringing that to the journalists. And then we have specialist reporters here, say someone in crime and security or someone in health and someone in politics, who, when the fact checkers say, you know what, we need to actually check if what the Taoiseach, who's the Prime Minister of our country, that's what they're called, is saying, that they can go to our political editor, who's like, do you know, there's a whole place where you can access all that information and you can go through the minutes yourself. So it's this kind of like information exchange that's very, very useful and collaborative. And then I think within the newsroom as well, we're trying to do and listen to the concerns of the audience. So when they're turning away from news organizations and saying, we don't trust you because you're in a bubble, you're following mainstream agendas, it's kind of really important to at least hear the cues, even if you kind of have to resist the sense. Like, we have a good sense of ourselves and our ethics, and we're quite transparent about how we do our job. But we do also have to constantly go, oh, are we actually just taking the government's word for it? Leinster House is where the Houses of the Oireachtas are. And to really promote a fact-first approach in an environment where we see, particularly because we get international news from UK outlets and we see them from the US, which we know media can be quite polarized. It's quite difficult to find a media outlet there that you can't say is in some way partisan, sitting on one side or the other, even if you can respect their journalism. That content, that material, is representing news media to Irish audiences too, because it's Anglophone and they read it. When you look at the Reuters Digital News Report every year, there is really good, hard kind of figures on people even paying for news. So these are people who value news and who pay for it. They're actually paying for subscriptions to the New York Times. They're paying for subscriptions to UK outlets. They're paying supports to the Guardian on one level. They may be paying for the Spectator on the other end of the spectrum, but they are people who are consuming news and they see it as something transactional. So they are being influenced by what they're seeing there. So for us, it's like the fact-first approach is really, really important in the Irish sphere, because we need to kind of create our sense of there's a good reason to be reading us versus somewhere else interpreting how Ireland is. And that can lead to, and this is going back to the tension with the newsroom, whatever, like inconvenient, as I say there, but necessary rebuttals to, we've always done it this way. It's also a really, really good way for us to reach our audience in a way that's not around all the, here's a debunk, here's a fact check, here's how you're wrong, but rather say, we know you're seeing a lot of this. Let us explain to you why you may be seeing it. So pre-bunking has become at least as important as the debunks as we do now, because the idea of being able to fact check every piece of misinformation or disinformation that comes out and correct the record is impossible. It's an impossible Sisyphean task. It's like playing whack-a-mole, if anyone is familiar with that game, where you're trying to beat the heads of the pop-ups in the machine before they come up. It's impossible, and you will never finish the job. So pre-bunking, having the ear to the ground, which I will say is a really collaborative audience piece as well, which has the side effect of creating and building better trust with audiences that have lost trust in the news industry to a certain extent, and have been told to lose trust as well. It's obviously a weapon against us. The news industry is not fallible or infallible, but it certainly is has been borne the brunt of people who are trying to replace themselves as an alternative to the news industry. So it's a really important trust building exercise, and by its nature is quite a transparent exchange of what are your questions, and we'll try and answer them. And then also to have fact checking recognized as a place where we build a resource. So reporters have been asked to more and more frequently report on things that they've never reported on before. In Ireland, when we were hitting the height of our recession, and when we started in 2010, Ireland was in a recession, and we were very quickly having to upskill reporters in economic reporting and business reporting and understanding what Standard and Poor credit ratings meant for Ireland and what it meant that we were buying bonds from the IMF and so on. And we've created a knowledge bank, which is now also being used by other practitioners. It is cited as a resource to other people who are interested in information integrity, everyone from public librarians who are often at the coalface of people coming in asking for information. We've seen it used by teachers in school classes as well. But we originally actually designed it to inform our own reporters on topics that they would be reporting on, so that we wouldn't misstep when we ourselves are reporting on something. So this is the kind of outputs that we're talking about now that are trying to tackle and complement and bolster the news outputs with the sort of important fact-checking tools that we have to our advantage. So on the left here, this is from 2018, and this is where we first saw a lot of Anglophone disinformation coming into Ireland. The eighth referendum was around changing abortion legislation in Ireland, so a very sensitive topic, and it did ultimately pass. But we found that one of the things where people were starting to be quite campaigning in other media outlets, and I think there would have been a perception that the Journal would be a campaigning outlet because we quite a young set of reporters. There might have been a sense that we would fall on one side of the argument from the other, and we actually had to have a meeting to talk about our own potential internal biases, recognize what impact that might have had on a reporting, and then decide an approach and a strategy to how we would carry out the reporting and the fact checking from that. And one of the things that emerged was we need to actually figure out what people feel are getting in the way, what's the friction between them and making a decision to vote in either direction. And this is where we came up with the Q&A series, and it became hugely impactful for people. And it came out with questions that we wouldn't necessarily come up with ourselves. So that was very much the audience listening piece, rather than us monitoring what the usual commentators and politicians were saying on the traditional TV and radio shows. So that was a good jump for us. It's following patterns like the hantavirus thing here, being able to draw on the experiences that we've had to write a good in-depth piece to explain this is probably the way this will go, and these are the things we're seeing being repurposed online. You may recognize them. And it's also a show and tell. So like this piece down here is rather than going into, here's a mad WhatsApp thing you've heard recently, we had it in the fuel protest, the army's going to do this, the army's going to lock you into your house, um, was to explain to people why people would even bother making up WhatsApp notes so that people could think about that the next time they hear something. They go, oh, I've heard that this is a bit of a scam, or people do this because it creates fear and then it drives you to this particular site. So it's really to try and give people the tools that we've built up internally. That's also something that we do with the Knowledge Bank. This is the resource I was talking about. It's on factchecking.ie. And it is to, I suppose, give people the way to think about how topics emerge rather than a load of fact checks about them. Those are also there. When you go into the topics, you can see most recent ones. But the idea is to give people the big picture so that you're genuinely allowing them to think for themselves. And we're trying to, I suppose, take back the conversation about make up your own mind, which was the battle cry to send people to social media and do your own research. And we're like, well, we're going to tell you how to do your own research. We won't do the research for you, but we'll tell you how we do it. And we had a section around how we look at like headlines, how we try and figure out whether something's a reliable source. We have like some instructional videos and so on. God, the time goes very quickly, so I'm going to keep going as quickly as I can, because I guess we'll get into the Anglophone part of it, and what we've seen in Ireland. So there's a sort of a thing, if you think of Ireland as this small island on the very edge of Europe, and there's a very big Atlantic over here, and then you've got the Irish Sea to the UK, and then the continent beyond that. We're in this strange little position. We're also the headquarter for a lot of tech giants, and let's not sugarcoat it. It's to do with our corporate tax regime, and but also the availability of an Anglophone, very well educated employment base for people. There's a lot of reasons, but Ireland does end up being, for a small country, a weirdly disproportionate player in the online discourse and what's happening. We're kind of halfway between the procession of the EU as a legislator and the US as a disruptor in the digital space, and particularly around disinformation right now, I think, is the conversation. So we're also seeing that as that we import narratives, and then we find Ireland as a place that exports narratives or is used as an example to bolster other people's agendas. So with the US, that would have been a place that we would have seen very much, say we're 2016 we started, 2018 we would have had the abortion referendum. We saw a little bit in the marriage equality referendum before that. We started to see things coming in, like this fact check down here was one I did myself, about abortion increasing the risk of women having breast cancer. And we were able to look at that time then at what was political advertising, what were paid for advertisements, and realizing that a lot of this stuff was actually coming from US sources, was both being paid by US sources, but was also kind of just a complete copy of the exact same language that was being used for 10 years previously around conservative religious pro-life groups in the US. And they were kind of seeing it's almost a missionary zeal to make sure that this kind of progressive social progression was something that they felt involved in being commentated, and they were kind of linking up with Irish groups in the same sentiment. So we started to see a lot of that. Then it started kind of globalist theories coming in. So we see here the Great Replacement. Now in Ireland, we started to see that emerge quite a few years ago as the Great Plantation. If you're Irish, you'll know what a trigger that is. If you're not Irish or you're not familiar with the Irish context, plantation would have been, from, I suppose, the early years of British colonial forces coming in, literally planting people from Scotland and other parts of the UK to take land in Ireland and to sort of change the landscape of language, politics, population, religious population. So plantation is a very, very loaded word in Ireland. So really to start sending around narrative that really had all the tropes of the Great Replacement global theory about, white people being replaced by people of color, and inspired by a Jewish cabal, all sorts of legs on this kind of theory, and calling it the Great Plantation is just putting a kind of an Irish whitewash on it. So it was sort of like a big global narrative, but, make it hiberno. So that's what we've seen a lot of when we're seeing this kind of a thing. So we try and explain that to people so that they recognize why they're seeing it and why they're potentially being manipulated emotionally because of it. And then it goes down to just the absolute difficult of the algorithmic and the heavily funded kind of campaigns like this one that our fact check editor Stephen McDermott discovered around anonymous accounts that were swamping X with extremist views, particularly after the Parnell Street riots in Dublin a few years ago. And uh, we were talking about, I suppose, how they were aping Irish accounts. They would have generic Irish names, they would have a tricolour and so on. And ultimately, the source of these, the origins of where they were being opened were not in Ireland at all. So it was very much a US based situation. And we've also seen that, I think, with just to look at this here. It's kind of like sometimes it's on purpose, like the disinfluencers thing or paid propaganda around very much Irish events like referendums, which is quite a serious, I suppose, attack on democratic process of people being able to vote based on the information presented to them within their own market. But it's also just by the accident of being Anglophone, we co-opt anti-vaccine narratives really quickly. Whereas we've seen much more of a lag between something that's happening here in an Anglophone sphere and being translated over to our colleagues in the larger European sector. We have a lot of contact with the European Digital Media Observatory. We're in the Ireland hub of that. So we talk to fact checkers in other parts of Europe. And often we collate a monthly brief together and they would go, yeah, these are the main things we're seeing, main claims we're seeing popping up. And someone would say, yeah, we're seeing that in Lithuania. My gosh, we've seen it in Spain. And for quite a number of years, we were always going, yeah, no, those aren't the ones going around here. Here are the ones going around here. And they were coming to us from the west over to us in the east. And people were like, Ireland, what do you like? It's always like so different what's happening here. We're finding that gap closing a lot more quickly recently, actually. And we wonder if some of that is to do with the ability to, I suppose, transpose AI-generated translations and whether these narratives are actually going to skip linguistic boundaries a lot more quickly now as well. Then on the other side of it, if you imagine our nearest neighbour is the UK, we're very influenced by what happens in the UK politically and historically. We've had to be, that has just been the case. But these days, what we find is Irish events are paid a lot of attention by particular actors in the UK market. Tommy Robinson is there. There's been a number of other, Liz Churchill, Katie Hopkins most recently as well. And they look at Irish events. It's not that they're necessarily caring a lot about what's happening to Ireland or to Irish people, but it's rather for them, look, can we just show you what's happening here? These guys are seeing record numbers of immigration, whatever, and it's all proof of civilization collapse. This also happens in the US, but in the UK, it's much easier for them to kind of make a link to it, particularly I suppose, even the genetic links and the historical migration links between the two countries. We would also see it that we end up kind of getting moved into the space where the UK is seen as, having higher levels of crime due to immigration, and that there's chaos from the multiculturalism that has grown the UK for many, many decades. That narrative is now being conferred in other countries, you see, like Sweden, but also on Dublin and Ireland. So that's where we see small news events here suddenly going very, very global very quickly. Interestingly, though, our sense is that a lot of this is coming and inspired from the US far right. So it's like Dublin, London, Gothenburg, like we're all kind of being lumped in together rather than the UK driving it. So we're just kind of being seen the same. There's also some kind of things to do with Northern Ireland, and for a time there appeared to be Irish anti-immigrant groups. There's a bit of an exploration that we had down here, based on a report by the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, who have two really good people working here on the Irish context, where they found that there was a lot of links between Northern Ireland loyalists, which is a very, very strange bedfellow for people who are purporting to be Irish ethno-nationalists, because that's traditionally Catholic, and then you're talking about loyalists in the UVF, that's traditionally Protestant, UK facing, seeing Northern Ireland as part of Britain and always part of Britain. And it was a kind of a very uneasy bedfellow for a while. What we don't necessarily see is them getting too involved on the street. They more advise on tactics and protests and ways of getting your point across. They don't actually talk too much about to the immigrant experience here, because I think they realize it probably wouldn't look particularly authentic to have loyalist British groups talking to the Irish about foreign invaders in quote marks. So but it is something that there's always a way in, and would have seemed like the most unlikely bedfellow 20 years ago. And now we find that there's a conversation constantly opening and a sort of a sense of entitlement to the Irish narrative in that space. Now, you've been talking about minority languages and linguistic diversity and how, I suppose, people can be targeted when they feel outside of the general sort of information spaces. And in Ireland, it's been a really interesting one. That agus cadatá ag tarlú I réimse na Gaeilge is what's happening in the Irish sphere. And what we're not seeing is a lot of disinformation that is emanating from Irish speakers themselves or targeting Irish speakers per se. So there's not necessarily the ability to radicalize. Now, there's a really clear reason for this, which is the Irish language here is tentatively spoken by a lot of people, but there's only a small number of places that are Gaeltachts. And in terms of people being fluent Gaelgori, they would be in the minority. But in Ireland, all Irish speakers, well, I can speak to, I would say 98% of them all speak English as well, and not as a second language, that's kind of interchangeable. They're bilingual people, and they don't all live in Gaeltachts either. So the idea that you're kind of radicalizing people they're not getting the information where everyone else who speaks English is not true of the Irish language speaking people in Ireland. So attempts to radicalize through that or to kind of feel like they're in a particular information bubble is not really effective. And so that's not necessarily how we have seen disinformation targeted at the Irish language or at Irish language areas. Rather, it's more a general kind of flag waving of to speak Irish or knowing the Irish language is under threat or Gaeltacht areas are being overrun or something, that this is just another way of coming at the idea of something with a very narrow definition of what it means to be Irish, is under threat somehow. So it's kind of more of that narrative. This young man here on the right, Dara Adelaide, this is a very good example of how that falls down in real life. So he was at a counter protest where there was an anti-immigration protest, and he was there as part of a counter protest. And he was approached by a fairly well-known self-styled citizen journalist who was up with his microphone and his mobile phone filming up to him. And this young man started, when he realized that he was saying, "Oh, where are you from?" As if he wasn't from Ireland as well, which he very much is. He started speaking to this anti-immigrant activist in Irish, in the Irish language. And a very viral video came out of that, of him basically, I suppose, kind of showing up that, well, who's the most Irish here? Like really, I suppose, provoking a conversation around what Irish identity actually means. So that's a really interesting thing, where the Irish language has actually sometimes been born by people who have no truck with some of the online narratives and is in fact used as a counter weapon against it. But what we've seen in some of the very few pieces of disinformation popping up is, as I said, where it's been said that it's proof that that Ireland is losing its identity, that Gaeltacht areas are being settled by people from other countries, and that the Irish language is being diluted by other languages coming in. They don't seem to have a problem with English being spoken for a very long time in Ireland, but it's certainly that way. And then there's other stuff which is, as our Gaeltacht correspondent has called it, rage farming, where he sees a lot of stuff coming up going, "Oh, look at this badly misspelled sign, they don't care about the Irish language." And he said largely they're Photoshop. So I think that's quite interesting. These would have been some of the things we've seen, which is that there was this is not the map that was going around, but there was a map going around saying that there were more Muslims in the entirety of Ireland, people living in the Gaeltacht areas, which is apples and oranges anyway in terms of segments, but also just trying to inspire a conflict that just doesn't exist. We took to actually producing some of these things in the Irish language so that they could go back to Gaeltacht areas, even though we know they're likely to read them in the English language too. So that was kind of an interesting foray for us into understanding how more can we distribute this pushback against the narrative that Irish language is under threat. It may be under threat, but it's not from other minority languages. It's through lack of support or, the Anglicisation in terms of language of everything in Ireland, the property crisis where people can't afford to live in Gaeltacht areas, that kind of thing. So this is the kind of thing we find ourselves debunking. And then there is also a really interesting thing where, because it's down as our native language, there is a bit of a sort of um, a sort of a broad attack on how do we target people in minority languages, because we can get to them because they're not being reached by, general public advertising, government information campaigns, or general news in that country or state that they're living in. And so we found the Irish language popping up as part of these kind of concerted attacks that have involved 20, 25 languages. And we're like, well, that's not going to land because nobody's necessarily looking for an Irish language site, as happened here with the Russian disinformation network Pravda. We had discovered an Irish language news website. Talking to our friends in the EU, in the other fact-checking outlets, they're like, oh, wow, not you too. And it turned out to be a very large outlet. We also see a lot of AI financial scams coming in, and they come in clearly translated in the Irish language, and they make no sense whatsoever. And they're kind of charming in some ways. But again, a bit of a scattershot attack on everything. In Ireland, I'm just going to bring this to a close in case there's questions, because I think we're getting to time, Iker. Really, in Ireland, we do have minority languages, and we do have an issue, and we are finding this on the fact-checking side of things, and we are not, I would say, in a position to tackle it on our own. In COVID, what we found was there were very hard to reach communities around some of the health and disinformation. This was recognised, I think, by public health information. We started to see posters going up in lots of different languages, certainly around Dublin City, where I live, where there are a lot of a huge amount of the population, but there's not a lot of otherwise targeted counter disinformation practices in Ireland, notwithstanding that we have a national counter disinformation strategy committee sitting now, that I give some consultancy to. But there's not a lot of looking at that, because largely we know that if your first language is actually not English in Ireland, you're not likely to be accessing the traditional sources of information. And to tackle that is probably a very big job that the country is very, very far behind on. Those posters are the most overt efforts that I have seen. We don't see a lot of it in the background. We know, for example, state agency advertising around everything from education rights to social welfare to health campaigns. There is a huge amount set aside for those advertisements to go out in the Irish language, which is kind of built into our preservation of the Irish language. There is not the same mandatory spend or level of mandatory spend for other languages that are really, really impactful in Ireland, like in Polish. We had our own situation a few years ago where we did a thing called the Good Information Project in the Journal, and dealing with the Polish community there, we found that there was just a whole swathe of, I suppose, not first generation immigrants, like where their parents, but their parents, they were not dealing in the English language largely at all, except for functional reasons. And there was very limited awareness of kind of sites like ours, which would be generally popular in the English language here. So we actually produced some of our content in, I think I have it here, in the Polish language. And we had it used in Polish language Saturday schools that a lot of teenagers access, and they were kind of bringing them home. And it was just a kind of a test to see whether that would be popular or not, and it was. But I mean, that is an initiative that is very difficult to do. That was a one-off, and I think that's the kind of gap that we're talking about here. The other thing is that when we see disinformation, moderation standards on the big tech platforms, which, as we know, have been falling away as they have kind of leaned into their source, their home in the US of siding with an administration that says you don't need to do anything about these algorithmic things that are affecting information integrity. In fact, fact checkers are evil. There's internal bias and so on. The moderation standards, anyway, even before all of that, were very much in Anglophone countries. So when I would be having a conversation with, a fact-checking colleague in Eastern Europe, and I'd be going, my God, we're finding so much stuff popping up on Facebook, say, around this, they would say, well, and we report it and it takes ages for it to get, and they're like, we've no one to report it to because there is no one in that organization working in our particular language. So even the moderators that they had. Also, I suppose the counter disinformation efforts that we've seen since the mooted community notes on X, we had a really strange discovery where there was a really good study carried out by Maldita, the Spanish counter disinformation and fact checking outlet, by Carlos Herrera. I can't remember his second name. It's fantastic. Can link to the stuff later if people want it. And they had analysed the community notes and found that fact-checking outlets in Anglophone countries were still being used by the public and cited in the community notes, which is good news that they saw as a good source of information. The journal was really high up. He was like, Susan, I don't know if you know this, but you guys are like third most cited last week in the world. That doesn't make sense. Like, that's really disproportionate to A, the number of pieces of content we put out, and B, what we cover, because we're very much facing an Irish market and catering to the issues that are there. So that means that there's really underserved communities that are outside the English language community. I think someone needs to mute themselves there. And I think the other thing, we've covered the last point there, but one thing that is really effective is when we can get into partnerships with people and organizations that are trusted within the communities that are harder to reach with the efforts that, say, we're making or other counter disinformation efforts. And that could be community groups on the ground. It can be health workers. I know there was a project around that in COVID. It could be something like I described in the Good Information Project. We linked in with kind of informal education systems to provide our materials in the appropriate language so that they could actually be used. So you're removing some sort of boundary and friction for people. So I think we're very much in the infancy of that in Ireland as well. And I would also say that we can't possibly tell how much disinformation is being aimed at minority languages in Ireland if we're not studying it. So there's, I think, a space in research for that and funding necessary for that so that then stakeholders like fact checkers and journalists can work from that and going, oh, we're not serving this community at all. So I think that's kind of, we're at the infancy of it, which is way, way behind where we should be. So I think that is it. And Iker, I've just left fact check at the journal.ie. If people have claims that they see and they'd like us to fact check, we welcome them. We also take people's WhatsApps and things like that as well. We try to be as open as possible. And check out factchecking.ie for a bit of an overview of the kind of things we've seen in the last 5 or 6 years. And then the bottom one there is where you'll find all of our kind of fact check work, analysis, explainers, and so on. Iker, do you want to let me know if there's any questions there? I can't see question marks or anything.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Susan, thanks a lot. Yeah, for this very interesting conversation or presentation, which, yeah, you touch upon, yeah, many, many, many interesting things that align very well with our project. So we're delighted. Yeah, the fact that this information goes across different countries, English-speaking countries, minority language as well, and just to have an insight about how you guys work as well with this information. So that's great. Yeah. So everyone, yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself or perhaps to write it down in the chat so that I will read it aloud. Susan, can I ask you perhaps to stop sharing your screen
Yes,
so that we
if I
see?
can figure it out. Hold on. There we go. I think yes, there we go.
Yeah, there you go. Thank you.
Thanks.
Right. So I have one question, and I see that Brendan has another one over there. Well, Brendan, perhaps you should start because otherwise, Brendan, yeah.
No worries. Look, thanks, Iker, for handing over. Susan, very quickly and really good, interesting presentation. I'm going to ask the obvious question, which everybody's asking right now. AI impact. Are you using this as part of your fact checking to speed up the process? Because obviously you're probably getting a deluge of content
Mm.
because of us.
Do you know what? We're actually not, and I'll tell you why. Because in the same way as fact check is embedded in the newsroom, one of the things that I think we're all behind on is a policy on AI. Now we have an internal one of sorts, but we have a certain amount of AI usage. Like even you start thinking when you start to write it down, you go, okay, we use Otter, which is transcription tool. We used LLM to create our own internal spell check and grammar tool that we've just started rolling out to people. It would be very, very useful for our investigative team to be able to analyze data sets, for example, things that are currently taking them a week to go through, property records we were doing to see what religious orders were flogging off without paying back their state reparations, amazing things that really underpin good journalism. So we definitely want to do it. And I can say it now because the team are working on it, but myself and another guy in here have been doing like a three-stage piece of work on the AI stuff. And the first stage that we're in at the moment is we've gone to everyone and we've realized it's a cross-departmental thing as well because we have a developers section in the journal and journal media. And it's like, okay, are you using AI and understanding like there's actually a bit of a schism there even among developers around, hallucinations can also happen in coding and what kind of building blocks you're setting up. So we've gone